when a simple flight turns into a public reckoning. The Orlando skyport bustled with activity as travelers moved toward their destinations, unaware that a quiet teenager at Gate A7 was about to find himself at the center of an unexpected spectacle. 17-year-old Barron Trump sat in the priority boarding area, his tall frame folded into a chair, eyes fixed on his phone. His casual hoodie and sneakers, paired with his calm demeanor, helped him blend into the crowd. But that sense of anonymity was about to be shattered. Gate Agent John Rivers approached the seating area with purposeful strides, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Barron. Something about the young man's presence seemed to demand extra scrutiny. "Excuse me, young man," John said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Barron glanced up, startled but composed. "Yes," he replied evenly. "I have a first-class ticket." John examined him with suspicion, his gaze flickering to Barron's casual attire. "Let me see your ticket." After a brief hesitation, Barron handed over his boarding pass. The name Barron Trump was clearly displayed. John paused, his expression shifting into something more rigid. Instead of backing down, he said curtly, "Wait here." Passengers nearby began to notice, their whispers creating a hum of curiosity. Moments later, Rivers returned, this time with Supervisor Alan Carter in tow. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket," Alan said, his tone firm but vague. "You'll need to step aside." "What issue?" Barron asked, his brows furrowing. "I booked this weeks ago." "Sir, please step away from the gate," Alan repeated, his words leaving little room for argument. Barron reluctantly moved aside, his frustration simmering as passengers continued to board without issue. Glances from onlookers and the occasional flash of a recording phone only heightened his discomfort. Alan returned after several minutes. "We're unable to verify your identity through the system," he explained. "Do you have another form of ID?" "My passport is in my carry-on bag," Barron replied, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "You didn't even check it." Alan hesitated, caught off guard by the logical response, before doubling down. "There are procedures we need to follow." Nearby, a woman holding a toddler spoke up. "What's the problem? He's just a kid with a ticket. Let him board." The comment went ignored as Alan signaled for two security officers, Miller and Garcia, who approached with measured steps. Their presence caused more passengers to pull out their phones, recording every moment. "Sir, please come with us," Officer Miller said. Barron's jaw tightened, but he grabbed his carry-on bag and followed them into a small, sterile room away from the gate. Back at the terminal, Melania Trump sat in the back seat of her black SUV, her phone lighting up with an influx of messages. One in particular caught her attention. "Something's happening with Barron at the airport. People are posting videos." Clicking on a link, she watched a short clip showing her son surrounded by security officers. "Driver," she said, her voice cool but commanding, "hurry." Inside the small room at Security Office 3B, Barron sat alone, fingers tapping the table rhythmically. His frustration mounted with every passing moment. When Supervisor Allen finally entered, he avoided Barron's gaze. "We're still working on clearing this up," Allen muttered. "How much longer?" Barron asked, his tone sharp. "You've had my information for an hour." Allen mumbled something about procedures and left again. Barron exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The energy in the terminal shifted when Melania Trump strode through the airport. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as passengers instinctively moved aside. She reached Security Office 3B, pushing the door open to find Barron seated across from the officers. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her tone calm but cutting. "Mrs. Trump," Officer Miller began, fumbling for words, "this is just standard protocol." "Protocol?" Melania interrupted. "You are holding my son in a room with no explanation. What kind of protocol is this?" Allen appeared behind her, visibly nervous. "Mrs. Trump, this is a misunderstanding. We needed to verify—" Melania's eyes narrowed. "You had his ticket, his passport, and his name. What more do you need?" Allen hesitated before mumbling about flagged names in the system. "Flagged because he's my son, or because someone decided he doesn't belong in first class today?" she countered. Melania's demand for accountability led the group back to Gate A7, where passengers lingered, their curiosity piqued. Supervisor Allen cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice shaky, "we want to apologize for the earlier situation involving Mr. Barron Trump. It was a misunderstanding caused by an error in our system. We deeply regret the inconvenience caused." Melania stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Thank you for your apology. But this is not just about my son. It's about how we treat every individual with respect and dignity, regardless of their name or background." The crowd erupted into applause, and a woman approached Melania, saying softly, "I'm sorry you went through that. It wasn't right." "Thank you," Melania replied graciously, her voice warm yet resolute. As they waited in the lounge for their rescheduled flight, Barron sat across from his mother, still processing the day's events. "I didn't expect all that," he admitted quietly. "You handled yourself well," Melania said, "but no one should have to get used to being treated unfairly." "Do you think they'll change anything?" he asked. "Change takes time," she replied, "but moments like this make people think, and sometimes that's where it begins." Later, Melania shared her thoughts online. "Today, my son experienced something no one should endure, being judged before being understood. Let's treat everyone with dignity. Respect is universal. Let's do better." As their flight finally took off, Melania gazed out the window, reflecting on the day. It wasn't just about Barron, it was about everyone who had ever been dismissed or mistreated. Moments like these were opportunities for change, reminders that respect is not a privilege, but a right. What about you? Have you ever experienced unfair treatment in public? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's continue this conversation. As Melania Trump stood firm at the gate, her presence alone silenced the murmurs around her. Barron, walking just behind her, carried the weight of the stares, the whispers, and the phones still recording. The words of apology offered by Supervisor Alan Carter felt empty, nothing more than a gesture meant to pacify those watching. Barron knew this was far from over, and one glance at his mother confirmed she wasn't done yet. Melania's voice was calm but unyielding as she addressed Alan. "This is not resolved. Pull the footage. I want to see how this began." Alan hesitated, his composure slipping under the weight of her unwavering gaze. "Mrs. Trump, I assure you, we're taking the appropriate steps to—" "Appropriate?" Her tone sharpened, cutting through his attempt at evasion. "Do you think allowing my son to be publicly humiliated qualifies as appropriate? Pull the footage." The crowd around them stayed put, their curiosity holding them in place. Phones remained raised, recording every detail. Alan gave a reluctant nod and gestured for one of the staff to retrieve the security footage. As they waited, Melania turned to Barron, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice softening for the first time since arriving. Barron nodded without speaking. He glanced at the sea of onlookers, their faces a mix of sympathy and intrigue. Despite his best efforts to remain unnoticed, he found himself at the center of attention yet again. This moment wasn't just a confrontation. It was a spotlight he couldn't escape. When the security footage finally arrived, Alan set up a laptop on the gate desk, his hands trembling slightly. Melania stood tall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as the video played. The grainy footage captured everything. Barron sitting quietly at the gate, scrolling on his phone, and the approach of gate agent John Rivers. The initial exchange was brief, but the escalation was unmistakable. It showed John motioning for Alan, followed by Barron being led away under heightened scrutiny. Melania's expression didn't change as she watched, but her hand rested firmly on the desk, her fingers gripping the edge. When the footage ended, she straightened and turned her gaze to Alan. "This," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade, "is what you call protocol? Harassing a young man who did nothing but sit quietly at your gate? This isn't protocol. It's targeting. It's unacceptable." Alan opened his mouth to respond but faltered, the words catching in his throat. Melania didn't wait for him to recover. "You owe my son more than an apology," she continued, her voice rising slightly as her conviction strengthened. "This isn't just about him. It's about the principle of fairness, of treating every passenger with dignity, no matter their name, their appearance, or the assumptions made about them." Her words resonated with the onlookers. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, murmurs turning into scattered applause. Some passengers exchanged nods, their expressions somber as they absorbed the weight of her statement. A woman stepped forward, cradling a toddler against her hip. It was Emily Harper, the same passenger who had spoken up earlier. Her face carried a mix of compassion and quiet frustration as she approached Melania. "I just wanted to say," Emily began hesitantly, "I'm so sorry for what you and your son have gone through. It wasn't right. None of this is right." Melania turned to her, her expression softening for the first time in hours. "Thank you," she said gently, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present moments ago. It means a lot to hear that. Emily glanced at Barron, offering a small apologetic smile. You handled it well, she said, better than most adults would have. Barron gave her a faint nod in return, though the humiliation from earlier still clung to him like a shadow. It wasn't just the events themselves, it was the reminder that no matter how he tried to stay under the radar, his name, his family, and the assumptions tied to them would always follow him. Melania turned her attention back to Alan. What I've seen today, she said firmly, isn't just about poor judgment. It's a failure to treat people with basic respect. You owe my son and every passenger here more than whispered apologies behind closed doors. Alan nodded quickly, sweat beading on his brow. We'll issue a formal statement, he stammered, and I'll personally ensure that this is addressed immediately. As the crowd began to disperse, Melania reached for her phone. She typed quickly, her face set with determination, and within minutes, her tweet was live. Today, my son experienced something no one should endure, being judged before being understood. This serves as a reminder to treat everyone with dignity, no matter their name or background. Respect is universal. Let's do better. The response was immediate. Social media lit up with reactions, some sympathetic, others critical, but most echoing a call for fairness and accountability. Across the terminal, passengers scrolled through their phones, finding the post and sharing it, the weight of her words spreading far beyond the walls of the airport. Later, as Barron and Melania waited in the executive sky lounge for their rescheduled flight, the atmosphere felt markedly different. Airline staff hovered nervously, offering refreshments, priority boarding, and repeated apologies. But Melania waved them off, uninterested in gestures that couldn't undo the events of the day. Barron sat across from her, his hands clasped in his lap. I didn't expect all that, he said quietly, breaking the silence. You handled yourself well, Melania replied, her tone softer now. It's not easy to stay calm in moments like that. He shrugged. It's not the first time something like this has happened, just the first time it's been so public. Melania leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. And that's the problem, she said, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. No one should have to get used to being treated unfairly, whether it's you, me, or someone no one recognizes. Barron nodded slowly, her words sinking in. Do you think this will actually change anything? Melania tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe not today, she admitted, but moments like these add up. People notice, and sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to make others think twice before they act. Barron said nothing, his gaze dropping to his lap. For the first time that day, he felt a flicker of something other than frustration, something closer to hope. As the boarding announcement echoed softly in the lounge, Melania Trump glanced at her son. Barron stood, adjusting the strap of his carry-on bag. The tension of the day still hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Staff at the gate, now overly accommodating, gestured for them to proceed, their polite smiles strained with the weight of their earlier mistakes. Barron walked ahead, his head held higher than before, but his steps measured. He could still feel the eyes of other passengers on him, the whispers that never fully disappeared. Yet he kept his gaze forward, his resolve growing. His mother followed closely, her calm presence offering him the reassurance he hadn't realized he needed. When they reached their seats, Barron immediately turned toward the window, putting on his headphones. Melania sat beside him, placing her purse neatly at her feet. She looked over at her son, noticing the quiet in his expression. He wasn't upset anymore, not outwardly, but she could see the lingering frustration in the way his fingers drummed faintly against his knee. She sighed softly and leaned back in her seat, her mind replaying the events of the day. The plane began to taxi, and Melania closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about an uncomfortable experience or an overzealous gate agent. It was about something larger. Moments like these revealed cracks in the way people treated each other, cracks that too often went unnoticed until they widened into something impossible to ignore. By the time the plane landed, the fallout had already begun. Melania's tweet had gone viral, sparking a national conversation that reached far beyond the confines of social media. News outlets picked up the story, playing the footage of Barron's treatment at the gate on repeat. The reactions were swift and polarizing. For some, it was a rallying cry for dignity and respect. For others, it was yet another example of privilege taking center stage. Parents from all walks of life shared their own stories of bias and unfair treatment, their voices amplifying the broader issue. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, one parent wrote in a widely shared post. What happened to Barron could happen to any of our kids. It's about human decency. But the backlash was inevitable. Critics questioned whether Melania's public stance was truly about justice or simply a way to command attention. How many people face worse every day without a platform to speak out? One op-ed asked. Still, the story refused to fade. Hashtags like dignity for all and treat people fairly dominated the conversation, and even late-night comedians weighed in cautiously, careful not to cross a line. Meanwhile, the airlines scrambled to control the damage. They issued a formal apology and promised to implement new training programs for their staff. We are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with respect and fairness, their statement read. But for Melania, words alone weren't enough. Back in Florida, the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Melania and Barron sat on their patio, the warm breeze carrying the faint scent of the ocean. For the first time in days, the world felt still. Barron broke the silence. "Do you think anything will actually change?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Melania turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "Not right away," she admitted, "but moments like these have a way of sticking with people. They make them think, even if they don't act immediately." Barron nodded slowly, gazing at the water. "It just feels exhausting," he said after a pause. "No matter where I go, it's like I can't just be me. I'm always someone's idea of what I should be." Melania reached over, placing a hand on his. "You are you," she said firmly, "and that is enough. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the quiet strength only a mother's love could provide. Barron didn't respond, but a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For the first time that day, a sense of peace began to settle over him. The story of what happened at the airport didn't fade from public consciousness. It grew, sparking debates about the treatment of individuals in public spaces, the biases people carried, and the importance of accountability. Schools introduced lessons on empathy and respect. Advocacy groups used the momentum to push for systemic change in industries that often prioritized efficiency over humanity. For Melania, the days that followed were a reminder of why she had spoken out in the first place. It wasn't just for Barron. It was for everyone who had ever been dismissed, judged, or mistreated. The ripple effects of that day were already spreading, touching lives she would never meet. As the world moved on, one truth became clear. Moments of adversity, no matter how painful, carried the potential for transformation. They reminded people of the courage it took to stand up, the importance of speaking out, and the power of compassion. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment of unfairness that made you question the way the world works? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation. Together, we can build a world where respect isn't just a privilege, but a right.